Hey guys, Tarke here, and today I've prepared quite a lengthy video. I've done a full write-up, which I will leave linked down below, so if you don't like listening to me read, you can just catch up to this. But basically what this video is I've made a very detailed list of everything that's happened to Path of Exile this year, from Conquerors of the Atlas through to all the leagues, giving my thoughts on each one, and then at the end I give like a final summary of PoE 2020, and what I would hope to see from 2021. So let's start off from the beginning, which was Conquerors of the Atlas expansion. So what was added? It added an overhaul of the previous Elder and Shaper influencer mapping system, fundamentally changed Atlas progression. It introduced the Watchstone system, introduced Conquerors themselves, awakened gems, and then the new influence-based items and mods. And what were the main complaints from obviously launch all the way through to now, because it's been the whole endgame system we've had for the year of 2020? Cirrus was received very poorly as the big bad endgame boss due to a series of bugs and questionable design implementations. Notable ones being storms, boss area terrain, invulnerability phases, dying off-screen to die beams, teleporting, and unintuitive mechanics making it difficult to learn the fight, especially when compared to bosses like Shaper, Elder, or Zeri. I would like to say that everyone's pretty happy with Cirrus now, but even now, after all the changes, Cirrus is a very debated boss in terms of how we feel about it as a big endgame bad. Time investments between Cirrus runs. This is something which has also been heavily argued from launch even through till now. Before Conquerors became deterministic, however, the best way to farm Cirrus was to cheese the system through spamming low-tier maps, so I'm very glad that's gone. Conqueror influence mobs spawning into maps often causes a lag for some players, and having mobs appear out of nowhere is still just kind of weird, in my opinion, and especially not good if you're playing in hardcore. Watchstones. Watchstones are a fairly unintuitive mechanic, and while they do offer a high degree of control, it's very easy for inexperienced players especially to screw themselves over with the system. It's also worth noting when I say inexperienced players, I don't mean people who've never played ARPGs before. You could have like 10,000 hours in Diablo 2, have a very deep understanding of how ARPGs work, but Watchstones are still just a bit of a fiddly weird system if you've never taken the time to watch a video on how they work. Conquerors also limited single map strategies from the previous Elder and Shape system. While many players love the increased variety of maps they run now, this is something which still comes up, so it's kind of a wash. And also sextants are also a lot more fiddly now that you put them on the Watchstones rather than directly onto maps. Was it fun? So, I would say it's pretty commonly agreed that the initial set of Conquerors and collecting Watchstones up to the first Cirrus encounter feels very engaging. The downside of this, though, is nearly everything past this point is fairly underwhelming and pretty repetitive. So we have a system where initially, once you understand how the Watchstones work, getting your first Cirrus feels great every league. Then once you've got your Atlas fully sorted out, it feels pretty good. But it has a very awkward and repetitive middle part. While it has its faults, Conquerors is generally accepted to be a cleaner system than the previous Elder and Shaper influence, and many people have this as their favorite iteration of the Atlas. Conqueror influence items are incredibly powerful, and Conqueror orbs and mods have made crafting far more interesting. Some would argue that certain mods are way too powerful, notably Explodey Chest. Power creep is always a very divisive topic in PoE though, but considering our old system was using unique in every slot, the fact that we use mostly just rares definitely does feel a lot more engaging. Personal rating. I'd probably give Conquerors a 7 out of 10. I really enjoy Conquerors up to the first Cirrus, but then I lose nearly all interest in the system after that point. It's also worth saying I haven't actually been a very big fan of any of the Atlas systems we've had. Every Atlas system we've had, in my opinion, has just felt very flawed, and this has been the best of a bad bunch. Getting into the leagues. Metamorph. What was added? The Metamorph mechanic. We had Tain as an unofficial master and his own zone. Catalysts. Catalysts, I've never been a big fan of Catalysts. I feel like they're very small impact. They are more item bloat, they have extreme power spikes for niche mods that scale off them, and they limit design space for future belts, rings, and amulets, mostly when it comes to stuff like elemental conversion, when you can like exploit specific niche catalyst mods. Metamorph was also a league which significantly buffed monster and boss difficulty. The main balance focus. So the main balance focus for Metamorph was Bow League, which was a bit of a meme, and added support for ballistas. Even though Bow League has been memed upon very heavily, the ballista support was pretty good. Main complaints during the league. Poor visual clarity, grey on grey, black goo on black glue. Picking up organs was tedious. On death effects, many complained the Metamorph bosses were too difficult. no real endgame system, and obviously content from Tane's Lab. Tane's Lab was also a cakewalk compared to map metamorphs due to the lack of map mods. Metamorph uniques were and still are exceptionally rare as they only come from Tane's Lab. Organ distribution was and still is incredibly uneven. Things to consider. This came alongside the Conquerors of the Atlas expansion, so people fade the Metamorph very well because of that, because they like the new Conqueror system. And it was the first league off the back of ExileCon, which was an all-time high for PoE after the announcement of PoE 2. Was it fun? After the auto pickup Organ Edition, Metamorph was a fairly loved league across the board. Did it go core? Later went core as a percent chance spawn, Sextant, Scarabs, and sometimes Zana. Personal rating, probably a 7 out of 10 again. Metamorph was a perfectly enjoyable league that had little depth, no real endgame as it was cut, underwhelming balance changes, and was mostly carried by the excitement of Conquerors and ExileCon. I did really enjoy the difficulty buffs to the monsters though. Delirium. What was added? Delirium is a mechanic, Simulacrum is an endgame event, cluster jewels, notably powerful and accessible uniques, the hardest content scaling in the game outside of extremes from deep delving. Main balance focus, introduce spell slinging, introduce Archmage and a huge push to mana-based builds, introduce the blade mechanic for blade skills, Second Wind was added as a support gem, this was huge, slight nerfs to Necromancer, Assassin and Guardian, a complete overhaul of fossil crafting, Vol side area overhaul, and we saw some improvements to Incursion as a mechanic. Main complaints during the league, visual clarity again, this time grey. On death effects, once again made a comeback, difficulty, time pressure while mapping, splinters and backtracking for loot in general, performance, cluster jewel rolling, and then a big thing at the time was balance and mid-league nerfs from herald stacking from just abusing how strong certain cluster jewel mods were. Things to consider. Not that much. We did have the Vulcan beta though come out in 3.10.2. Was it fun? While Delirium was heavily criticised for a multitude of reasons, it's also a fan favourite, especially since it's been rolled into the core game. Cluster Jewels revitalised build making, and while it's taken some people a while to get used to Cluster Jewels, people generally agree that Cluster Jewels were a great addition to the game. Did it go core? It went to core as a percent chance spawn, through Delirium Orbs, and sometimes appearing on Zana. Personal rating. Launch Delirium was probably a 9 for me, that then went down to an 8. The constant complaints around the league mechanic, mostly around the difficulty, the grey on grey, and people not liking the time constraints aspects, quickly became pretty exhausting, and Delirium now dominates endgame mapping strategies. Cluster Jewels are excellent if hard to roll now, so yeah, overall I'd say it's an 8 out of 10. Harvest League, what it added. The Garden. Fully deterministic crafting, Infused Lab and Beachhead. Main balance focuses. Two-hand buffs, slam skills and war cries, dual-wielding nerfs, the brands rework, timeless jewels notables added to the skill tree, which is very unexpected, chieftain and berserker reworks, stun reworks, and then cluster jewel weighting changes, which then made cluster jewels significantly hard to roll. Main complaints during the league. The Garden itself, a vanilla mapping experience as all the content was in the Garden and not really in maps. Ashabi was a very lackluster final boss, and the surprise of her being a boss was spoiled by global kill announcements. Harvest uniques were underwhelming. Harvest encounters offered little to no challenge outside of random one-shots delayed on death effects, which then had further delayed on death effects. Rolling cluster jewels, as mentioned. The extreme back and forth discussion on deterministic crafting. Performance, Bloom. Bloom, you wouldn't think was such a big thing, but for anyone who remembers it, Bloom was a big deal. Things to consider. New Zealand went into lockdown, significantly impacting Harvest development. Was it fun? Highly dependent on who you ask, and even those who look back fondly on Harvest will be quick to mention its shortcomings. Most hated the gardening and core Harvest mechanics, but the majority of the playbase loved the deterministic crafting. Meanwhile, a smaller subset of the community hated the powerful deterministic crafting, finding it sucked out a lot of the long-term playability and enjoyment from PoE's endgame. It is worth considering how many quit the league early who may have enjoyed the crafting systems but never interact with them as they couldn't stand the initial gardening mechanic. People liked Infused Lab and Beachhead though, pretty much universally. Did it go core? We've been told it will be going core in some way in the upcoming 3.13 league. So we don't know what's being cut, what's being changed, but it will be going core. Personal rating. 4 out of 10. Okay, hear me out. So Harvest was a very weird league for me for many reasons, but ignoring those, Learning how the garden worked and optimizing setups was interesting for the first few weeks, but once you had a setup, the garden became entirely static. It just didn't need to be. It could have really benefited from some kind of upgrade system to keep that side of the mechanic engaging long term. As is, it was too complicated to put off players while also offering a minimal depth for those who enjoy crunchier systems. So it didn't achieve anything. It put people off, and then people who enjoy that stuff, there wasn't actually enough for them to engage with. I was part of the crowd that found harvest crafting far too powerful, and as harvest itself offered no real challenge, I had little reason to be invested in harvest past the first month. If harvest crafting was gated behind more challenging content, I could have been okay with the system though. So yeah, if it was a case of we did very hard content and we had very powerful crafting, fair, but it was very easy content, very powerful crafting, just didn't work for me. Community discourse around the league was exhausting, as everything was one extreme or another with little to no middle ground. You either were part of the problem because you didn't like it, or you were right because you did like it, and it was just ridiculous extremes on both sides. It's worth noting that while I found Harvest incredibly underwhelming, I can completely understand the reasons why some people adore this league and cannot wait for it to be added to the core game, and hopefully the way it is added makes everyone happy. So we'll have to wait and see for that. Heist. What was added? Heist as a core mechanic, alternate quality gems, replica uniques, experimental bases, chest and weapon enchants. Also experimented with the idea of followers and smart loot. Mid-league, we saw the stash tab affinities and folders offering extreme quality of life improvements. Main balance focus. Curses, steal skills. We saw changes to some classic spell changes, stuff like Firestorm and Discharge. And we saw a soft focus on self-cast through changes to Intensify in other little self-cast systems. Main complaints during the league. Performance, doors, bugs and rogue AI, fundamentals of heist mechanics, mostly around the alert system itself, on death effects, again, difficulty, multiple iterations of the league with vastly different approaches to the core mechanics of the league, all applied within a very short time window. If you go back to my coverage of Heist, I think I had like 4 videos saying how different the league mechanic was in the space of like 2 weeks. It was pretty ridiculous. We also saw mid-league nerfs to rogue gear and changes to how the rogue gear functioned, which meant that if you were struggling to understand the system, that was overwhelming. And if you did understand the system and you engaged in the system, your gear would be invalidated every other week. The economy. Exalted prices have been at an all-time low. The economy has been very strange for softcore trade players. We also saw league content being patched in that was directly tied to challenges that weren't available at launch, which meant if you were someone who wanted to get all your challenges in the first week of launch, you couldn't. There are a lot of players who actually just rush 36 challenges, and that's their main goal, and they just couldn't because it was time-gated content. It was also another league mechanic that took place outside of maps directly after Harvest, which was a league that mostly didn't interact with maps at all. XP was also a very big issue. Things to consider. New Zealand went into an unexpected second lockdown during the development of a clearly overambitious league. Still, this is a management issue, but is worth noting. We also had a huge bot ban wave, which possibly doubled down or caused the strangeness with the softcore trade economy. Was it fun? Again, highly dependent on who you ask. Even those who loved Heist at launch ran the risk of becoming numb to the constant iterations and changes that the mechanics saw. Meanwhile, many were put off the league entirely due to the poor start. So there's lots of people who would have really enjoyed Heist in its current state, but just didn't enjoy the core state and just kind of wiped it off. Did it go core? So again, it'll be going core with some yet to be changes in 3.13, so we'll just have to wait and see how it's going to be going into the core game. Personal rating. Again, another hard one. I was lucky and had a very stable launch experience with minimal performance and bugs, so I had a very positive initial impression of the league. I was a big fan of the lore, world building, and gameplay variety outside of mapping, and I really hope we see more of this amazing writing going forward. If you asked me week 1, I probably would have given this league a 9 out of 10. However, with the constant changes, delayed content, low availability of blueprints, underwhelming balance changes, and again, exhaustive community discourse around the league, I'd probably drop down to a 7 out of 10, maybe an 8 out of 10 if I was being very forgiving. That being said, depending on the changes Heist sees in 3.13, I could see this as being an amazing addition to the game, and I genuinely believe Heist has serious potential if it's developed further. Heist launch has been my most enjoyable launch experience of a league this year, hands down. Closing thoughts on PoE in 2020. A fairly mixed set of leagues all in all, with a very strong start and a very iffy finish. I would say PoE started off to a great start with the Metamorph being a perfectly adequate league, and it makes a good benchmark. It didn't do anything that revolutionary, but what was there was fun and engaging, and it was just a real shame that it was missing its endgame system. With a proper endgame system and some more dynamic balance changes, I think Metamorph could have gone down as one of the all-time best leagues ever. Delirium honestly just needs to launch without the visual clarity issues and more variety than every zone just being grey. With the prevalence of Delirium and endgame mapping, this is an issue that will have to be addressed at some point. And also, I do worry a little bit about Delirium since it will have to see some kind of loot nerfs because it just multiplies everything. Delirium rewards will be a real issue next time we see a full-on loot explosion league, because if the next league is a big mapping league and we have Delirium on top of that, it'll just be silly. So we'll have to see some changes. Harvest and Heist both suffered from being undercooked and needed more development time. Yes, both of these leagues did happen during lockdown, but you can't excuse everything because of that. I'm very curious to see how both of these will be added into the core game going forward. So now, just to talk about some stuff I hope to see coming to PoE in 2021. Balance. More significant balance changes. Maybe not every league, as that isn't very realistic, but 2 big balance patches every other league could work. So PoE used to do massive balance changes every league. Actually, I remember a time when they used to try and add a new skill gem every week. That's how insane PoE used to be. Meaning that even if you don't care for a league, you had new things to explore from a build-making point of view. These days, though, most leagues will push 1, sometimes 2 archetypes, and that's it. So if you don't care for the league, or the league launches in a bad state, and you're not vibing the new build archetype, then you're basically screwed. Elementalist. Not just Elementalist, but Elementalist. Ascendancies are a big part of this problem, as underwhelming Ascendancies can lock out entire parts of the tree and massive swathes of skills from being attractive to players to experiment with. I really enjoy playing Witch, but because Occultist and Elementalist are incredibly niche and haven't been all that interesting outside of very niche builds, I just haven't really played any any Witch at all for the best part of the year and even longer, to be honest. The fact that we saw a patch which had a massive curse focus, but then did do anything to Occultist, was a real travesty, if you ask me. That shouldn't happen. Also, give me a trap patch, GGG. I want to see some trap quality of life in 2021. League design. Better league pacing. PoE has a very diverse player base who enjoy different aspects of the game, and when the league is becoming so mechanically varied and experimental in design, it's crucial that leagues flow neatly into one another. For example, Breach, Legion, and Delirium are much-loved leagues, but doing these 3 leagues back-to-back would be disastrous for players who hate being under time constraints. There's a lot of people who hated that sense of constant pressure. You can do these leagues once a year, twice a year even, but if you just pace the wrong leagues back-to-back, it will put off your player base. Another example of that would be what happened going from Harvest directly into Heist. This was a failure in this respect since we had 2 leagues that didn't interact with the core mapping experience. So now 3.13 has to be a mapping-focused league to engage those players. And I think it will be that, but if it wasn't, then it would seriously put off those players because they've spent 9 months without a mapping-focused league. Realistic scope. PoE 2 is a very scary and ever-present ghoul lurking in the shadows of PoE. Whenever you talk about PoE, PoE 2 always rears its head. Everyone wants to experience the new and amazing systems, but realistically, the earliest we'll see this is 2023, maybe even 2024. At best, December 2022. Like, seriously. Likewise, also Diablo 4, by the way. Constantly pushing massive leagues with insane scope can't be helping the development of PoE 2, and it shows when leagues come out underdeveloped. Having patches with very clearly defined goals to allow a clear workflow for PoE 2 is very important, not just for the health of current PoE, but for future PoE. And hopefully this would also lead to more engaging and even patches over the year. So as an example, you could have League 1 being a small scope league with major balance patches. So that would be a real focus on revitalizing parts of the skill tree, ascendancies, and skill gems. League 2, this would be a large league with very minimal balance changes. So maybe just 1 small archetype push and that's it. League 3 would again be a smaller scope league with a major balance change. And then League 4, usually the big December league, would be an expansion league altering pre-existing gameplay systems like what we'll be seeing from the 3.13 league, with a smaller scope league and minimal balance changes. This would be a much more realistic way of doing it. While it's very exciting to spectacle creep every single league, it's just not sustainable, and I think it's really important that we see more significant balance changes throughout the yearly cycle. Finally, stripping back and developing pre-existing systems. From what we've seen of the 3.13 teasers, it looks like we're about to see some significant overhauls to how we interact with past League mechanics. I hope this also comes alongside improvements to those core League mechanics, though, as a lot of PoE is excellent, but lacking polish and has just become outdated with time. Hopefully the smart loot experiments from Heist get rolled into the game sometime during 2021. Otherwise, I would love, but don't necessarily expect to see it, a Flask rework sometime between now and PoE 2. Flasks have needed a rework for quite a long time, but it's a pretty big undertaking, and I'm not sure how much they can realistically cram into 1 year. So yeah, that's basically what I think of 2020. Overall, it's been mixed, but there's been some very good core additions to the game, and I'm very excited and hopeful to see what next year has to show. So I'm Tarke. What do you hope to see coming to PoE, and what do you think of this year? Have a good day. Bye-bye.